Question is that the amendments be disagreed to, and I call the honourable member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased to speak against this bill because it's dangerous. It aims to sacrifice the interest of the Australian environment at a critical time for the political interests of this hopeless, reckless coalition government. Deputy Speaker, it aims to sacrifice the interests of the Australian environment at a critical time for the political interests of this hopeless, reckless coalition government. Anyone who votes for it is condemning Australia's biodiversity to further harm at a time of enormous risk. Anyone who argues for it has been sucked in to this government's cheap, self-serving game. Deputy Speaker, the most important task when it comes to the EPBC is to fix it so that we get effective environmental and heritage protection. Why? Because quite clearly we don't have that now. After 8 years and 3 terms of this government, we have a failed environmental protection system which is leading to animal extinctions, it's leading to coral bleaching, it's leading to marine heat waves, it's leading to the destruction of ecosystems around this country, and the number one imperative of this government when it comes to the EPBC should be ensuring that that environmental protection framework works. They've had 4 or 5 environment ministers in that time, one of them sitting here at the table, and they have failed to deliver an environmental protection framework that does the job. A year ago, Juukan Gorge was destroyed because the protection framework is not good enough. Yesterday, it was noted that UNESCO intends to list the Great Barrier Reef as in danger. Deputy Speaker, in March, another 10 species were gazetted on the EPBC list as extinct in March. We know that the Australian sea lion was listed as being critically endangered earlier this year. It is our only endemic sea lion species, and we know that the koala in Australia is at risk of being extinct by 2050. Yet all this government wants to do is rush headlong towards the devolution of decision-making powers, pushing its own responsibility along with the present dysfunctional protection framework with no additional resources for the states. The truth, Deputy Speaker, is it only wants to do that so it can perform some silly dance, posturing as the best friend of the mining and resources sector. It could so easily accept Graham Samuel's recommendations, which would begin to improve what are howlingly bad environmental outcomes, and it could so easily improve the position when it comes to assessment times and decision-making clarity. But it doesn't want to do that. And we're hearing from members in the chamber today exactly why it doesn't want to do that, because it wants to pick a silly fight. That's what it wants to do. It wants to try to cosy up to the resources industry and perhaps to some state governments rather than undertake its responsibility to the Australian environment. It would be sensible if it was to listen to its own government-appointed reviewer and apply the changes that he has recommended. We would consider that a responsible step to take. We would consider that a responsible approach to the Graham Samuel review and to the desperately needed reform of the EPBC Act, but that isn't what the government wants. No. The government wants to play a cheap political game. It wants more slogans and more stunts. It wants to create a point of difference between itself and Labor, even at the cost of sacrificing Australia's environment and Australia's biodiversity. The one thing these bills will guarantee, the one thing they will guarantee, if passed, is further environmental decline and further biodiversity loss, because that is what is happening right now under the EPBC, right now under this government, and nothing the government has proposed in these bills do a single thing to improve that position. And what I find really disappointing is, to be honest, Deputy Speaker, I mean, this is an important debate. We know the last time they brought in an EPBC bill at the last moment, they had to gag the debate because I think they realised as it progressed what a disaster that was going to be. We've not seen that bill again. But with this bill, which is relatively momentous, there's been a tiny, tiny handful of people on the government side who've come in and been prepared to speak about it, and not one of them has shown that they have the faintest idea of what is in it. To be honest, I've never seen a greater instance in my time here of people coming in and simply saying what must have been written on the piece of paper for them, that this bill is magically going to improve environmental conditions and the timeliness of decision-making and assessments. They say that as if it's a mantra that's been handed down to them from on high, and they have no understanding whatsoever of the actual detail of the bill. I'm surprised also that some industry representatives in the aftermath of Juukan Gorge don't seem to have a basic grasp of what the government is trying on here, and then they're not calling on the government to do its job. I mean, this is a government that has presided over a 510% blowout in assessment times. 95% of all decisions have been late. 79% of all decisions have had compliance failures. I mean, that is the incompetence of the current government that, of course, has led to environmental damage and biodiversity loss, but has also meant that assessments and decision-making is woefully slow and woefully inefficient. Why hasn't the industry been saying to this government, for God's sake, do your job for once, do your job? That would make a nice change. Deliver an effective environmental protection framework which can be the basis for clearer and more timely project assessments. Deputy Speaker, people in the community watching this debate should hold on to 5 key points to help them understand what is going on here. Number 1, our environment has already suffered enormous harm and is on a trajectory of further decline. We are the world leader in extinctions. 35% of all the mammals that have gone extinct since 1500 are Australian. If you look at North America, they've had 1 mammal extinction in the post-colonial period. We've had 30. We are a world leader, shamefully, when it comes to mammal extinctions. In March of this year, the government listed as extinct in the EPBC the desert bettong, the Nullarbor dwarf bettong, the Capricorn rabbit rat, the great hopping mouse, the western barred bandicoot, the southeastern striped bandicoot, the Nullarbor barred bandicoot, the long-eared mouse, the blue-grey mouse, the dusky fruit. That's just in March. Those are extinctions listed in March. That is what is happening to our environment. The Great Barrier Reef has had 3 bleaching events in 5 years, the only bleaching events in history. We had a marine heat wave in 2011 that destroyed an enormous amount of seagrass in Western Australia. This government has presided over enormous environmental decline, and Graham Samuels himself said to them that the trajectory is for further decline, and this bill does nothing to improve that. Our environment protection laws and supporting mechanisms are not working. So 1, the environment has been smashed. 2, the environmental protection laws and supporting mechanisms under this government are not working. The framework is stuffed. They've cut 40% out of the Environment Department, and they've made ridiculous decision after ridiculous decision that puts our biodiversity at risk. Number 3, it is quite possible, Deputy Speaker, it is quite possible, and any sensible person would argue it is necessary and urgent for us to do something to improve our national environment protection framework. Graham Samuel, who was appointed by this government to undertake the statutory review of the EPBC, provided a very clear blueprint for this government as to how it could be achieved. Improve national standards, put in place a watchdog with teeth. Really simple. Improve national standards, put in place a watchdog with teeth. He even drafted the interim standards for them. He's provided them with the interim standards. All they have to do is put them in place. But this hopeless, utterly hopeless, reckless, self-interested government, after 8 years and 3 terms, has ignored its own government review. Straight out of the blocks, the Minister for the Environment, the 4th or 5th Minister for the Environment, said, we're not having an independent watchdog. Don't worry that 79% of all the decisions have got compliance failures. We're not doing that, right? That was the very first decision. That was after the interim report. We hadn't even got the final report, and they were ruling that out. They have not accepted the interim standards that Graham Samuels proposed. Graham Samuel said, on Indigenous heritage protection, by the way, Graham Samuel said that the current Indigenous laws, in addition to not working and being behind community expectations, he recommended that the National Environmental Standard for Indigenous Engagement, Participation, Decision-Making that he had formulated should be immediately adopted. This is in the aftermath of Juukan Gorge. It should be immediately adopted. Can the government even bring itself to do that? No. So it is not in this bill, in the previous bill, in this bill, not picked up the recommendations of the Graham Samuel review one iota. It hasn't adopted the interim standards that he's recommended. It isn't putting in place an independent watchdog with teeth. This Assurance Commissioner that's contained in this bill will be housed in the department. The action plan of the Assurance Commissioner has to be approved by the Minister. The Assurance Commissioner will have no power to look into, to inquire into and to assess individual decisions. It is a SOP. That when the Minister last year said, oh look, we're not having that altogether, that was just a little bit of a bridge too far. Too many people, perhaps some people in the government and certainly some sensible people out in industry said, hey guys, there's only 2 recommendations from this government review. You kind of have to make at least a show of accepting one of them. So but that's what the Assurance Commissioner is. It's just a weak, mealy-mouthed gesture towards that recommendation without actually putting in place the changes that's needed. And the final point, Deputy Speaker, is that the only driving imperative here in this bill, the only driving imperative here is silly, cheap, idiotic, super dangerous political stunts and games by a desperate government that wants to hang on. That's the only thing that's going on here. And people in Western Australia know that. I think people in the industry should have a bit of a closer look at that. I've spoken to people in industry in Western Australia from the time the government embarked on this process and said, do yourself a favour. Do yourself a favour. Talk straight to this government. Tell them that you would like to see the EPBC reformed properly, improve the environmental protection framework, which we must have for the benefit of our environment and our biodiversity, and to meet community expectations. Do that. Graham Samuel's given you the blueprint. It's not that hard. You just have to follow what he's recommended to you, what you actually commissioned him to undertake. Implement that, and then, on a bipartisan basis, if you could ever bring yourself to do that, move towards a system where you might get some improvements in assessment times. But this government has no interest in that, Deputy Speaker, and people in the sector should know. They write these letters. I got this letter hot off the press today telling me I should get serious about this bill because the Graham Samuel review highlighted there's an immediate opportunity to devolve decision-making without compromising environmental outcomes. Except that's exactly what this does. It compromises environmental outcomes. The environment in this country is being smashed. It is being smashed. We are seeing more extinctions and more ecosystems under threat with each passing day, and it's because we have a failed environmental protection framework. We have a hopeless government that has done everything in its power to defund and weaken the Environment Department. They've implemented a threatened species strategy, the first version, which was an abject failure. It set out to improve the position of some targeted species. If you take mammal species, for instance, 20 targeted mammal species, they hope to see improved trajectories in those species. In some cases, this is animals like the Gilbert's potteroo, whose home range is down around Albany in Western Australia. Gilbert's potteroo is the most endangered mammal in Australia. There's a few hundred of them left. And of those 20 target species, how many did they get an improved trajectory for? Barely 8, they said in the report, 8 out of 20. And when you looked a bit closer, of the 8, 4, so half of the species for which there was improvement, the improved trajectory was because they're declining less quickly. So that population is not increasing. It's still decreasing. It's still slipping towards extinction, just a little bit more slowly than it was before. That's the record of this government. Now they follow that failed strategy with the new threatened species strategy, which was delivered late. Guess what? No targets, no actions, no funding. That'll all be supplied, we're told, by the end of the year. Got an environmental crisis, these people just twiddle their thumbs. So people in the community should know what this is about. This is 100% a stupid game by a stupid government. It is simply an attempt to create political division to suit their own needs. It is an abdication of their responsibility after 8 years and 3 terms in this place to protect the Australian environment and our biodiversity. It is one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. It has been hammered through habitat loss, through feral animals and now through climate change. It desperately needs a protection framework that will reverse what Graham Samuels has said is a trajectory of decline. but this government cannot bring itself to do it. None of its ministers for the environment stand up for it. They get pushed around by the member for Tagney and other people who spend all their time designing what they think of as clever ads for the pages of the West Australian rather than doing their jobs.